Hello, my name is Scott Geltner. I'm a member of the Governor Isaac Shelby chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. Today I'm going to be giving you a presentation on colonial surveying. Now first I just want to describe what a colonial surveyor actually did. At the time, during the colonial period, the main role or main duty of a surveyor was to establish boundaries. Those boundaries could be between the individual colonies, or those boundaries could be based on personal land ownership, separating one person's land from another. Now, in the early days of the American colonies, the original colonies were given charters for a very specific area of land that they could colonize. Originally, those colonies were very far apart. They were really spread out. And so at the time when the original colonists came over, in their minds, there was so much land that they just couldn't conceive that this land could at any point be filled with people, or they would have trouble recognizing boundaries with other colonies. However, as time went on, the colonies grew, more people arrived, and eventually the colonies started encroaching on each other, and so then they became very concerned about where the individual colonies, where their actual boundary was, and also as more people came in and it was obvious that there was not as much land available as they thought, people started becoming more concerned about where their actual land was compared to their neighbors. So the role of the colonial surveyor was to come in, again, to survey the property lines of an individual owner, or it could be a government boundary for a city or for the individual colonies. Now, there are many famous surveyors in American history. You know all of them probably, but you probably didn't know they were surveyors. The first one that I'll just briefly mention was Abraham Lincoln. As a young man, Abraham Lincoln was a surveyor. The next one is Lewis and Clark, of the Lewis and Clark expedition. As part of their duties when they did their expedition out to the Louisiana Purchase out to the West Coast, they learned to be surveyors so they could do some surveying as they did their expedition. The next famous one is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, again, as a young man, he was a surveyor. His father was also a surveyor, and his grandfather at one point was a surveyor. And the most famous surveyor of all in American history, which we all know, but you probably didn't know he was a surveyor, is George Washington. Again, as a young man, George Washington was a surveyor. Now, it's an interesting story about George Washington, how he became a surveyor. George had an older brother named Lawrence who was a sailor. George really looked up to this older brother and he wanted to be just like his older brother. So at the age of 14, George informed his mother that he wanted to be a sailor just like his older brother. Well, George's mother was not excited about this idea. She didn't want two of her sons being sailors. First of all, being a sailor was a very hazardous occupation. There were shipwrecks, pirates to deal with, and they were gone for very long periods of time. So George Washington's mother did the best she could to dissuade him from being a sailor. So the older brother, on one of his trips to England, bought a brass surveying set and the equipment necessary to be a surveyor and brought it back and gave it to George. Now, the compass his brother would have brought back is very similar to this. The compass that George Washington had was actually made out of brass. This one is made out of wood. A brass compass at that time was a very expensive item. It was top-notch equipment for surveying. Now, as I said, this one's made out of wood. During the colonial period in America, most of the compasses you would have seen were made out of wood. For a couple reasons. First of all, it's a lot easier to make one out of wood. Also, a wood compass is a lot lighter than a brass compass. And another reason is just the availability of brass. During the colonial period, the British government was controlling how much brass actually came into the colonies because they were afraid that if the colonists got too much brass, they could take that brass and then make a cannon with it, and they didn't want the colonists making cannons. So this compass, it's very similar to like a compass you've probably seen today. It's just a lot bigger. It's circular. Sometimes it's referred to as a circumrivator. It has a needle in it that points to the magnetic north. I have it tilted now, so it's not really pointing to the north. And it has your cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And then it has all the numbers around it giving you the degrees off of north. The other thing it has is some upright vanes. Basically, there are little slots on them, and you won't be able to see them, but there's a very thin little hair running through these slots. That's what you use to line them up. So it's kind of like using a rifle. You would get down, whatever it is you're aiming for, you would turn it like that, and then once you're lined up, you let the needle settle down and it tells you what the direction is. Now I want to talk a little bit about the life of a surveyor. As I mentioned earlier about the famous surveyors in American history, you may have noticed that I said when they were a young man. As I said, George Washington, he announced his mother he wanted to be a sailor at 14. His mother changed his mind. At the age of 16, he was acting as a surveyor, and at the age of 17, he actually became the county surveyor for the county he was in Virginia. And he was actually the first official county surveyor in the colonies. So, as I said, the surveyors were typically, it was a young man's occupation. It was a very strenuous job. You can see some of the equipment I have around here. This is just a part of what they would actually have. They would have to haul all this equipment around with them. So it's a lot of physical work involved. You're basically camping out probably just about every night. As you're moving along, as you're surveying, you have to set up a new camp each night. You have to move all this equipment, pack everything up and move it along. The other thing about surveying is that most of the surveying would have occurred in the winter months. In this area here in the Ohio Valley, the primary season for surveying would be about mid-October to about the 1st to the middle of April, depending on how late or early spring arrived. The reason they like to survey in the winter, there's a couple of obvious reasons. First is in the winter, all the leaves are off the trees and bushes, so you can see further. Surveying is a lot easier the further you can see. If you're in a really overgrown area with a lot of bushes and there's leaves on them, you can't see very far, which means you have to do extra setups and extra lines. It just makes life worse for you as a surveyor. Other reasons why they like the winter was insects. I have a couple of diaries of surveyors, the diaries they kept while they were doing surveying in the summer. And in their notes, in their diaries, they're complaining about the biting flies, the gnats, the ticks, the chiggers, things like that that would affect you in the summer that you wouldn't have in the winter. The other thing is snakes. For some reason in these diaries, the colonial surveyors, whenever they encountered snakes, it seems like they always recorded it, and they would always try to kill them. And they would record how many snakes they saw and how many they killed. Again, in the winter, you're not going to see as many snakes. But it is obviously going to be a lot colder in the winter, so you have to deal with the cold, the snow, and potentially ice. Another reason why they like to survey in the winter was that when you're surveying, you have to go in a straight line. If you come across a nasty area, say it's really wet, it's kind of muddy or maybe swampy, you don't have the luxury of being able to go around it because you don't want to go through it. If your surveying line says you have to go straight through it, you go straight through it. So again, it was a young man's job. The other thing too about being a surveyor is the hazard with the Native Americans. In areas of like Ohio and Indiana, when surveyors started coming in to survey out that land for the settlers that were going to come in later, the Indians real quick realized that whenever they saw this equipment, they knew what it meant and what was to follow. So there for a period, anytime an Indian would encounter someone with this equipment, they would just kill them outright because they didn't want the land surveyed. So a lot of the times the surveyors, whenever they're traveling with their pack animals, they would have to hide their survey equipment in case they encountered a Native American and didn't want to run that risk of being killed. Okay, so I already showed you the surveyor's compass. Now when you're surveying, there's two pieces of information you need to know. So if I'm set up here with my compass, and say there's a tree off in the distance. To survey in that tree, I'm wanting to know its relationship to where I'm standing here. There are two pieces of information I need to know. The first is the direction of that tree from where I'm standing. Well, as already mentioned, the compass is going to give us the direction. The other piece of information we need is the distance. Now, back then, how they measured distance was with what they called a surveyor's chain, or more properly, it's called a gunter's chain. The person who invented this chain, his last name was Gunter. This chain was invented around 1620, and they were used up until the early parts of the 20th century. So that was a pretty good design, a pretty good device he developed there. So what you see here, it's basically made out of metal, and it has a lot of different links to it. A full surveyor's chain is 66 feet long, and it contains 100 links. Now, this is one link. From the top of this ring to the bottom of that ring is what is known as one link. The length of one link is 7.92 inches, which seems like an odd number, but not when you realize what's going on. So as I said, this chain is 66 feet long. It has 100 links. So if you take 66 feet, divide it by 100, that'll tell you what the length of a link is in feet. You multiply that by 12 to get in inches, and you'll come up with 7.92 inches. You can do that as a little assignment if you want to, just to see if I'm correct. The other thing about this surveyor's chain is you will notice it has these little brass tags on the bottom. Each of these tags has a different number of points on it. And the number of points on the tag indicate where that position that tag is on the chain. So this one I'm holding right here, it has 2 points on it. That represents 20. So that tag is on the 20th link from one end of the chain. Another one here, this one has 4. So this one has 4 points on it. That means it's 40 links from the end of the chain. The reason why they did that is because when you're doing a survey, you got this chain all stretched out. In the course of a day, you could be in adverse weather conditions, you could be getting hot, you could be getting tired, whatever. At the end of the day, you're just not going to be thinking straight necessarily. So by having these links, if you're measuring something out and it's not going to be exactly a full chain, you're going to need to know how many links it is on that chain. So if you didn't have these tags, what you'd have to do is you'd have to go to the end of the chain and say it's actually 73 links is what the measurement is. You'd have to go to the end of the chain and start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 73. Your chances of miscounting are pretty good. So by having these tags, you go to the nearest tag, which in this case would be 70. You just go 1, 2, 3, 70 plus 3, you got 73. The other thing is too, is a lot of these things are going to be showing you, they were designed to be very simple in application. The surveyor himself is going to be a somewhat educated person. He's obviously going to have to be able to read and write. He's going to have a good knowledge of math, not just addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. He's also going to have a pretty good knowledge of geometry and trigonometry. So he's going to be pretty well educated. He's going to be able to do math and things like that. The people helping him, however, are not necessarily going to be as well educated or sufficiently educated to work at the same level that he will. So a lot of the things they have on the surveying equipment is to make it simple for someone who may not be highly trained, may not be highly educated, to be of assistance to the surveyor. The other thing they would have had is these survey pins. These are nine of these pins are in a set. Basically, it's just a little metal rod. These are sometimes called survey arrows or survey pins. So what would happen is when they're out doing a survey, you have 2 people on the chain, 1 person on each end of the chain, and they're called the chain pullers. So what they would do is the lead chain puller, which would be the person out front, he's kind of leading and directing where they go with the chain. He would be wearing this quiver, and this quiver would have all these survey arrows in it. So when they come out and they measure, say for instance, they're starting from this compass. The follower is going to start right here underneath the compass. The lead chain puller, he's going to go out as far as he can for one chain. When he gets to the end of the chain, he's going to pull one of these out, stick it in the ground, and that's going to mark where the follower needs to come up for the next measurement. So once this is stuck in the ground, they're going to walk the chain further out, and the follower is going to put the end of the chain right here where this pin is. After they make that measurement, when they get ready to move, the follower is going to pull up this pin, and he's going to keep it. Now there are 9 of these, and you're probably wondering why are there 9 instead of 10? The reason being, after they have done 9 chains, and now they're doing their next one, when the lead chain puller reaches down for an arrow and there isn't one, that means that is their 10th chain. And when that occurs, the lead chain puller yells either tally or out, one of those 2 words. Again, this is a system to be able to keep track of things very easily. They're not having to keep track of, well, how many chains did we pull? They just know when they run out of arrows, that's their 10th chain. You yell tally or out. The follower then brings these survey arrows back to the lead chain puller, he takes them over and they continue on. So the surveyor is going to keep this with him, and this is called a tally belt. So what it is, it's just a little leather belt, and in this instance I have these little leather discs, and there are 8 of these discs. And again, you're probably wondering, why are there 8 discs and not 10? Again, there's a very practical reason. So every time the lead chain puller yells tally or out, the surveyor slides one of these over. The chain pullers, they do 10 more, they yell tally or out, I slide another one over. And so eventually, say I run to the end, they do this 8 times and I've slid all these 8 leather discs over. That means they have pulled 80 chains. Now what is significant about 80 chains? Well, again, if you do your math, one chain is 66 feet long. Every time they do 10 chains, they yell tally or out, so that's 660 feet. When I slide one of these over, each one of these discs represents 660 feet. When I do the 8th one, if you do your math, 660 times 8, you'll come up with 5,280 feet. In case you don't know, the unit of length we refer to that has 5,280 feet in it is 1 mile. So when this last disc is pulled over, they have surveyed 1 mile, and then again they would start, if they need to keep going, they would slide them back over. Now, back in the colonial period, a good day of surveying could be up to 10 miles. A bad day of surveying would be as few as 2 miles. So again, keeping track of how much you have done was very important to them. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the process of going through a survey. Now, let's assume that you are a pioneer, a new settler into an area that no one has ever claimed before. So what you would do is you would go out and you would walk around an area that you think looks very good for where you want to set up your farm. Most of the settlers would have been farmers of some sort. So you're looking for good farmland. Back then, the good farmland would have been in a valley next to some sort of stream or creek or river. So you would go out and you would walk around this land seeing what you think looks the best that no one else has claimed and figure out how much of this land you want to get. Now, as you're walking around, when you're determining what land it is you want to claim, there's a couple ways you can mark the boundaries of your land. The first is to make a mark on a tree. Now, I just brought this in. In real life, they would have picked a much bigger tree than what is being represented here. You know, they probably would have found a very big, prominent tree to make their marks on. They would have taken a device like this. This is called a timber scribe, or some people will call it a timber race. This edge right here, this bent, curved edge right here is very sharp. It's like a very sharp knife. And so what they would do is whenever you wanted to mark a tree as the corner of your boundary, you would take this, and you can see here, I just did a single slot here, but on a bigger tree, I could make an X, I could put my initials, I could put a number, any sort of identifying mark I wanted to make on this tree to identify it as being a corner of the property I'm going to claim. The other thing you could do is you could make a pile of rocks. In some instances, if you got a lot of rocks nearby, if you got a corner of your boundary, you would make a pile of rocks in kind of a shape of a pyramid or a cone, and that's called a monument. So between the trees and the monuments, you would identify the boundaries that you want for your land. Once you have done that, then you would go down to the county surveyor and you would tell them that you want to apply for a land warrant. You don't have to have a lot of information this time. Basically, you just have to give them an estimate of how much land. You could say, it's approximately 50 acres. It's in the Fredonia Valley along Livingston Creek. That would be about all the information you would have to give them. The county surveyor would check to make sure that there's no one else in the process of claiming that land. If it looks good, he will issue you a land warrant. When you get the land warrant, that is the first step in giving you permission to have the land surveyed and to claim that land as your own. So at that point, as a potential landowner, you would need to hire a surveyor to come out and survey the land you want to own. So as a surveyor, you're obviously going to have to pay me. I'm going to show up alone more than likely. If I have someone who's wanting to be trained or learn to be a surveyor, they may come along to assist me, but more than likely I'm going to arrive by myself. As we talked earlier, you have to have chain pullers. So in addition to paying me, you're probably going to have to pay your chain pullers. Now, in many instances, one of the chain pullers would be the person applying for the land themselves, or if he had a son that was old enough, the older son could be a chain puller. The other person being the chain puller more than likely would be a neighbor or a future neighbor of the land you're going to claim. Now, the reason for this is, first of all, as I mentioned, as a potential landowner, you made marks on the trees and you made these monuments. Who better is going to know where all these marks and monuments are than the person who put them there? So obviously, it makes sense that someone who knows where all these marks are needs to be a chain puller. The reason a neighbor more than likely is going to be a chain puller is they have an interest in the land as well. They want to make sure that you're not surveying any land that they may already own or that they're wanting to go through the process and apply themselves. So that's where the chain pullers would come from. In a lot of instances, you're also going to have what they call bush cutters. Again, if you're doing this in a wilderness, there could be a lot of brushes, there could be tall grass, whatever. You're going to have somebody that's going to have to clear the path so they can run the chain. So once you get the survey done, the surveyor, he comes and he writes up a report. And these are two examples of surveys. These are actually from the original owner of land out in western Kentucky. These are actually surveys that were done for an ancestor mine in western Kentucky. So this is a legal document. You may not be able to see it, but up here it has a sketch of the layout of the land, and all this writing is a physical description of the land based on the surveyor's notes. He has the directions, distances, the landmarks. You know, if I put a mark on a black oak tree, he's going to have in here, ran this line to the black oak tree, then ran to a monument, whatever. An interesting thing too is down here, they have the names of the chain pullers. Since this is a legal document, the chain pullers were there. They did the survey with the surveyor. So basically they're acting as witnesses to this document. And again, I can say that I know that the landowner or his neighbors were the ones pulling the chain because in the research I've done, in almost every instance, a relative or a neighbor is listed as being the chain puller. Now, I mentioned earlier about there being 5,280 feet in a mile. It's kind of an interesting story on how it came out to be 5,280 feet in a mile. And it has to do with Roman soldiers and oxen plowing field. Back in the days of the Roman Empire, the largest unit of measurement that the Romans had was called the mille passum, which literally translated means 1,000 paces. So when a Roman soldier is marching, their pace was actually 2 steps. Now the Romans were a bit shorter than we are now, so the average pace of a Roman soldier when he was marching was about 5 feet. So the mille passum was 5,000 feet. So in the early days of continental Europe, the Roman mile was 5,000 feet, and that was the unit of measurement they used. England, not really being fully controlled by the Romans in their history, they came up with a different unit of measurement, and that was based on how far an ox could plow before it had to rest. Now obviously different oxen, different land, different plows, it's going to be different distances. But the distance they came up with, the kind of average, was called a furl long. Now those of us here in the Kentucky area, we may recognize where I'm going with this. In horse racing, if you've ever seen the Kentucky Derby, other horse races, their measurements are in what is called a furlong, and that's where it comes from. A furl long became the furlong. Again, it's 660 feet. So going back to the surveyor's measurement, I said this was 66 feet. The reason it is 66 feet is then when Gunter came up and developed a survey chain, to make things a little simpler, he decided there would be 10 chains in a furlong, and that's why the chain is 66 feet long. Now continuing on with the story. So in England, the furlong was their biggest unit of measurement. Eventually, as time wears on, the English kind of decided, well, they needed to adapt the mile the Malay pasum, which became the mile, as their unit of measurement as well. The problem was the Roman mile being 5,000 feet, there are 7.5 furlongs in the Roman mile. They didn't want to have to deal with halves. So what they did is they rounded up, they made it 8 furlongs, and when you do the math, 660 times 8, you come up with 5,280 feet. So that is the reason why there are 5,280 feet in a mile. So that pretty much concludes my presentation on colonial surveying. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for your time.